righty. All right, so good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us today. Like I said, I realize it's short notice today, but I really appreciate so many of you hopping on last minute to learn more about empowerment and self-advocacy in navigating the college process for your student with accommodated needs. So we're happy today to have Amy Curran, who is our Director of Accessibility Services here, to share important information with you on how you can help your student transition from high school to college. Again, we will be recording this session, so you'll be able to go back and look at it after. And we will have times for questions and answers at the end of the session. Sorry, more people are hopping on as I'm talking, so I'm trying to let them as we go along. So we are just starting off, and again, I'd like to introduce Amy Curran, who is our Director of Accessibility Services. And again, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box, and we will address them all at the end of our session. So Amy, welcome, and thank you.
All right, we're all set, right? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Nicole. I'm Amy Curran. I'm the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services at WPI. We used to be known as the Office of Disability Services. So if you've been puttering around the webpage recently, you'll notice that there's been a name change. It's the same office. We just changed the name to be a little bit more progressive and welcoming. So that's who we are. This is a PowerPoint, like Nicole said, about navigating the college process for students that have accommodations, whether it was in high school, middle school, and they'd like to move them into a college setting. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to gear this more obviously towards WPI and how our processes are on campus. And we'll go from there. All right, so let's go. All right. Sorry. All right, the first slide that I have for you, and this is a big topic that a lot of parents like to talk about when they call my office, or what are the differences between high school and college, what changes along the way. As you can see, high school, there's structure built into the assignments, teachers built in short-term deadlines, there's a lot of checking in the classroom, or in maybe a learning resources room, or in the guidance counselor's office. There's just a lot of give and take between the students and teachers there. Test review is often built into the class time and assignments. And if you need help, the teacher is going to check in with you or require you to meet with them. And a lot of that changes once you matriculate onto a college campus. Students really are responsible for creating their own structure. Students get deadlines from their syllabus or online sites. You're not going to often see professors write due dates on the board. It's more or less on the syllabus. So it's up to students to refer back to that. Time and time again, which is a new skill to be built along the way. Students are expected to take time to study outside of class and do their assignments. There's not a lot of work time built into the classroom setting. Most of that work and studying is happening after you're done with class for the day. Professors will suggest office hours, but they're not mandatory. They're there more for students to pop in, say hello, ask some clarifying questions. There are, some professors will ask you to come and meet with them, but more often than not, they're expecting the students to come to them with questions. So there's a few different changes along the way that students just sometimes need to take a little time to absorb and get used to. Another big thing to talk about is the law, what changes from high school to college. And while you're in high school, your student is in high school, they're covered under IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and FAPE, which is a free and public education, excuse me. Schools usually identify the student. A teacher can write a report or reach out to guidance or an adjustment counselor and say, I'm worried about this student, how can we support them? IEP plans and 504 plans are developed amongst the school community and the parents and the student and the providers. There's individually designed instruction, modifications, accommodations, and for many of you that are familiar with IEPs, there's benchmarks for progress. A lot of that changes once you go to college. You're now, the law that's covering your students' success in college is the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. The student is responsible for disclosing their disability, where they would register with an office like mine. Professors aren't coming to me and asking, who is registered with your office. It's up to the student to disclose that information. IEP plans and 504 plans are often not sufficient documentation. That's a big sticking point on a college campus. It's not that we don't look to those documents to refer back to them for accommodations, but those kinds of documents are generally written for high school appropriate accommodations, not college appropriate accommodations. And so sometimes we need the documentation that went into building the IEP, a neuropsych, a psych eval, those kinds of documents. In college, reasonable and appropriate accommodations are put in place. So we can't, fundamentally alter the curriculum. We can't put in place alternate assignments. Instead, we can put accommodations in place to help facilitate, growth for the student. And then finally, the biggest difference between high school and college is that the access to the academic experience. No one wants to talk about it, but a student, if they're struggling, they need to reach out for help. There isn't necessarily a team of people that are there to swoop in and help them. It's up to the student to find those people, and those people would be people that work in my office. So here's a few questions that are really common. The next few slides are questions that we hear a lot in our office, or are frequently asked ones, so it's nice to kind of go over them. The first question is to disclose or not to disclose. When applying to WPI or another college or university, should a student share that they have a disability and may be seeking accommodations? I will be fully transparent with you and say that's a very personal decision. Some students are fine disclosing whatever it is that they struggle with, whatever adversity they've faced. Other students are a little bit more hesitant to share that information, and it's really a personal decision. If students do not disclose that information during the admissions process, that's 100% okay. If they do, don't be alarmed if someone from an office like mine reaches out to you or reaches out to your student to say, hey, I noticed that you had mentioned that you have ADD and you used extra time on exams. Admissions keeps a running roster of students when they're reading through their essays, and if a student has disclosed that they might need services on campus, they'll get in touch with me and say, this is a student that might benefit from some outreach from your office. So like I said, it's very personal. No one's going to make you do it, but if you do want accommodations on campus, you would need to disclose to an office such as mine. You don't need to disclose to admissions, but you would have to disclose to us. Moving on to the second question, who's the first contact? How does the student find out about services available at the college or university they're considering? My best piece of advice to all of you is to search the website. Offices such as mine are usually called the Office of Accessibility Services, the Office of Disability Services, the Office of Student Support. Really, if you plug in any of those names, you'll come up with an office like mine. That is the first contact that you want to make in order to talk about what kind of accommodations you are seeking for your student, or to have your student reach out and ask those kinds of questions. And you want to do that once you've decided when you're coming to the campus. You can ask the kinds of questions ahead of time as you're touring campuses and looking at campuses, because all different universities have different programs and they're set up with more support, less support. You kind of want to figure out what's going to work best with your student. I feel like once you start looking at colleges, that's when you want to contact the offices and start asking, what kinds of documentation do I have to send to you? What kinds of accommodations can be supported with my students' documentation? Most colleges will ask for that documentation right around the time that the student is admitted, because even though your student is still in high school, universities and colleges are like a machine. We just keep chugging along. We're not on the same schedule as a high school, so we still need documentation ahead of time. And the reason why we ask for these materials ahead of time is because if it's not sufficient enough, we want to give you enough time to get what we need in order to put accommodations in place. Moving on to the third question is about documentation. What kinds of documentation will my student need to provide in order to start the accommodation process? I've touched on this a little bit before. Like I said, most people are coming from a high school setting where they have IEPs or 504 plans. You can feel free to submit those. We will always look at them. I have a staff of 5 people in my office. 3 of us review documents to see what has helped this student in a high school setting. But if it's not sufficient enough, as I've mentioned before, we'll reach out to you and say, we need something a little bit more updated. I'll give you a good example. If a student sends in documentation from, let's just say 5th grade, and they're now a senior in high school, all of the scales that were used to go into their documentation were for children, and they're now considered an adult. So some of the accommodations that they have put in place might not be what they need anymore moving into a college setting, simply because the way you approach school and assignments is different. So I always say, don't hesitate to send in documentation, but understand there are times that we will reach out and ask you for more. But we also understand too that it's hard to come by. It's expensive, and it's not like you can just call someone and schedule an appointment for new documentation. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And so we're always willing to work with a student to potentially put accommodations in place on a temporary basis, knowing that what documentation you sent to us in the summer, we can put accommodations in place based on that. If we need new documentation, we'll give you until like December to get it to us when your student is home on, winter break. We never want to discourage students from seeking out accommodations. We just need to make sure we're up to date following ADA guidelines. But we work with you, so we're not going to ever shut the door in your face and say we can't help you. So documentation is very much an interactive process. There's a lot that goes into it. The fourth question, and this is the most popular one that we see in our office all the time. Are there accommodations for this? What kind of accommodations can my student have for that? And my best answer to everyone that asks that question is it is 100% situational. It is done on a student by student, case by case base. We don't have, what works for one student might not work for another. I noticed that especially when students submit their documentation from high school, that some of the accommodations that they had in a high school setting are not college appropriate. I'll give you a good example of that is that there are some times where students, they can't have exams on the same day. They need their exams broken up into multiple days. That is very situational. Sometimes we're able to do that at WPI, but more often than not, we're not. And it's solely because it's a term-based school and classes move so quickly that it's difficult to move around exams, because exams, sometimes there's a week where there's 2 exams in the same week and they build off of each other. So we can't, there are certain accommodations we can't put in place, but then there's workarounds for us to try and put other supports in place. So I think it's important to think about, what do you need for your student to feel successful while they're here on WPI's campus, instead of focusing on what they entirely used in high school, because it just changes. Like I said, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but it is very much an interactive process between your student and my office. What can we put in place to support you now? How can we, maybe talk about different accommodations that you didn't even think of that seem more appropriate in a college setting? So it's very, very, I keep saying the same thing, but it's true. It's very situational, and that's where you want to call our office, ask questions, talk to us about, what it is that your student is looking for, and then we can go from there. Moving on to this question, adulting. This is a big topic. How can the student prepare to manage their own accommodated needs and supports? Coming from a high school setting, and I can say this comfortably because I have a child that just graduated from high school, who's going to be a freshman in college as well. I think parents are so used to being that center of support. How do we help implement this for our son or our daughter or our child? How do we make sure accommodations are being met? How do we make sure that, our son, daughter, child is doing A, B, and C? And that's easy to do in a high school setting for the most part. Nothing's very easy all the time, but for the most part, once you move to college, it's pretty much 100% on your students' shoulders to be managing their own needs, meaning that they're contacting my office, they're speaking up on their behalf, they're using their self-advocacy skills, they're having an open and honest conversation with members of my office about what it is they're seeking, what it is they need for support. And I think that is sometimes very easy for some students, but I do think it's difficult for a lot because they're just not used to doing it. And so we understand that. We're not going to turn anybody away. We understand that there's a learning process. And that's something that my office really strives to help students with, is building their self-advocacy skills. We ask a lot of questions. We set up a lot of appointments with incoming first-year students just to kind of help pave the way for them and have them realize that we're a friendly group of people, we're easy to interact with, and we're here to help support them. And I think that the more students can become part of those conversations instead of relying solely on their parents, which I know is very hard. And again, I speak from experience because I am a parent. The more we can encourage the students to reach out on their own, or have a parent send the email in but copy their student on it so that way we're all part of the conversation. I think that just kind of helps ease everybody in and allow people to feel a little bit more comfortable moving forward. We'll move on to the next question. Parenting, this is another one too. How involved will I, as the parent, be in my students' interaction with the Office of Accessibility Services? Again, this is very situational. I personally feel like parents care very deeply about their children. They want to see what's best for them. They want to make sure the supports are in place. I understand all of that. But for the most part, people in my office, myself, my coworkers, we really like to build that rapport with the students. Your student is a young adult now, and we treat them as such. And so I respect the fact that parents want to be involved, but then there's also times where the conversation needs to just be between the student and myself or my coworkers. So I feel like I don't discourage parents from calling. If any of you know anybody who's interacted with me knows I have no problem answering emails. I have no problem answering phone calls, but I'm not going to disclose everything I talk about with the student with their parent. I'm not going to, disclose the nitty gritty of everything we're speaking about, just because I just feel like it doesn't help build rapport between the student and myself. So for parents, I feel like becoming involved is great, but a lot of times what I encourage parents to do is ask your student. Instead of coming to me and asking me, what did you talk about? What did you plan? What are they doing? How are they doing? It puts people in my office in a really awkward position because there's sometimes students are saying, please don't tell my parents. I really don't want to talk to my mom about this. And then if I have a mother call me, I have to be like, I'm so sorry, you have to talk to your son or daughter or child. So I feel like keeping the lines of communication as open as possible is great. And I know that's easier said than done at times, but that's my best piece of advice. It's just understanding the process, ask questions, but realize that there are times that we can't answer you. All right, moving on to another question. Professors, how will my students' professors know when the student has been approved for accommodations? So part of the process in our office here is that the students reach out to our office, they submit documentation, and then we review it. After we've reviewed the documentation, we will get in touch with the student to do an intake. It's a very easy process. It's a hi, how are you? Let's get to know each other. What kinds of accommodations are you looking for? What can we put in place for you? How can we support these accommodations for you? And then on WPI's campus, every single student who's registered with our office, which right now, I just ran the numbers this morning, it's 656 students. All 656 students out of that number who have accommodations for the classroom setting have to submit what's called an online accommodation letter. It's an electronic letter that we walk them through this during the intake process. The student fills out this form. They're checking off who they are. They're verifying their accommodations. They're verifying the classes that they're in. They're agreeing that this information is correct. And then there's literally one button that they click on. It's submit, and then an automatic letter is generated for their professor. So that way the student and the students can see on the form, your letter has been sent. And then they can also log back into the system and see when their professor looked at their letter. So that's how professors know. The letter says, what office it is. The letter says the student's name and has their email on it. And then it basically just goes into the student should be graded like any other student. The student is registered with our office. So someone's looked at their documentation and said, yes, these accommodations need to be put in place. And at the very end of the letter is just a list of the accommodations. We don't share any private personal information. We don't share anything about diagnosis. That is 100% up to the student. If the student feels like they want to disclose that information to the professor, they can. If the student wants to stay silent and not say a thing, they don't have to. It is 100% up to the student and their comfort level. Because that email is sent out electronically and it comes from, my office's email, but it has the student's email on it, There are some professors that will reach out to the student and say, hey, I got a letter, let's talk about this. So I always say to students, just be prepared that once you send that letter, you're opening up the lines of communication. Don't be startled if a professor reaches out to you and says, I'd like to talk to you about this. How can I help support you? And that's where the student will want to, share with the professor what they're comfortable sharing with and talking about how accommodations help them in the classroom. And this is a two-part question. So can professors refuse to provide my student with officially approved accommodations? No, they cannot. There is a caveat there in the sense that on WPI's campus, I'll talk about testing accommodations really quickly here. A professor cannot refuse to give a student extended time, but they can say, I can't do this in the classroom. And the reason for that is because on our campus, we have a space set aside called the Exam Proctoring Center. EPC is what it's referred to on campus. It's right in the same building as the Morgan Dining Hall. If you're looking at the doors of the dining hall, it's to the left of it. It's a soundproof room kind of down the hallway. A professor can say, I can't give these accommodations in the classroom simply because there might not be time. Once their class ends, another class is coming in. And if the professor has open office hours after their class, bringing a student back to their classroom, back to their office might be noisy. If there isn't a place a student is potentially taking their extended time sitting in a hallway or sitting at a desk to the side of the professor's desk where other students are coming in. So a professor can say, I can't help you in the classroom, but you would come to the EPC and take your exam there. Professors cannot say no. And for the most part, they're very gracious. The professors that have worked at WPI, they work well with our office. Getting accommodation letters is nothing new. It's standard for the process. They get new batches of them every single term. If a student ever felt like a professor was not taking their accommodations seriously, or if they ever felt like a professor was not treating them fairly, that's where they could come and speak to us in the office and say, there's a problem. Can we talk through how to work through this? We would never let a student work through something like this on their own because we don't want to put anybody in the weird position of a power dynamic, a student against a professor. So we kind of work with the student to talk about, like, this is how I feel like I'm being treated unfairly. This is how I think that something is going wrong in this class and I don't feel like I'm being accommodated. And we kind of, ask those kinds of questions. We'll reach back out to the professor, get their viewpoint of what's happening, and then we kind of come together to come up with a plan. I've worked at WPI for going on a year now. I worked at a previous university for 6 years in the same role. And honestly, it's far and few between that this happens. So I feel really proud that professors are they like to work with our office. Students are good about advocating. It's just important to keep the lines of communication open. All right. The next question is resources. Is the Office of Accessibility Services the only place a student with accommodated needs can seek support? No, not at all. There are so many supports on our campus. And again, speaking to a previous slide, it's just a matter of the students getting used to finding the supports. My office is here for accommodations, whether that's housing accommodations, classroom accommodations, campus accommodations, temporary accommodations for if a student, fell and got hurt or needed a scribe or needed elevator access because they broke their leg playing rugby or whatever the need is. We handled those accommodations. Other resources on our campus are academic advising. There's the Academic Resource Center, known as ARC. That's where tutoring takes place. There's also MASH, which is math and science help. That is also group tutoring. There's also the Student Development and Counseling Center, SDCC as it's referred to. There's the Career Resources Center. There's the library. There's the Writing Center. There's so many supports on campus. Students just need to know where to reach out to. Another huge support that I feel like a lot of students don't realize when they first started is their professors. Professors have open office hours once or twice a week. That is where they can go to clarify questions about the assignments, clarify questions about something they might have missed in the classroom. Professors want to hear from you. They want to know how you're doing. So it's important to reach out to them. But there's a lot of resources, and I always say to students that if I don't know how to answer that question, or if I don't know how to help you, I will seek that information out and send you in the right direction. I like students to come back to our office and ask us those questions. because we want them to feel supported. We don't take on everything. We will parse them out to other departments, but we're definitely here for support. I kind of think of us as triage. How do we get you in the right direction? And that's my final question. I went through that a little faster than I thought I was going to, but this is where I would open it up to questions for anybody that has heard anything, or if it sparked a question, or if you have any concerns or anything, I'm happy to help answer them.
So thanks, Amy. That was a lot of really important and information. I'm going to give people time to add their questions to the chat, but in the meantime, a couple questions did come through. You may have covered some of this, but we did have some folks joining us a little bit late, so I want to make sure that we are able to accommodate everyone's questions. So one question, what if my child only has an IEP? Is that an acceptable form of documentation?
It is sometimes. There's no other way to get around that. It really all depends on what it says. IEPs that are built for, you know, elementary, middle, high school, they're put in place to reach benchmarks and objectives, and those aren't the same measurements that we use in a college setting. So as long as there's documentation, should include the student's name, should include their diagnosis, should include the functional limitations of their diagnosis, meaning what about their diagnosis impacts their academics, and then finally what college appropriate accommodation recommendations are being made. And oftentimes it's that piece that's missing from the IEP. IEPs are often generated with high school in mind, and so sometimes we need someone else to look at it and say, how out of these accommodations, what can be moved over? What is appropriate to move over to a college setting? So IEPs can sometimes be enough, but often not enough. Often we need some sort of other supplemental documentation, and that's very situational by diagnosis, by student. On our website, we have a documentations guidelines tab that you can go to, and there's so much information on there based on diagnosis, what kind of documentation we're looking for.
All right, and this just came through. Is there a rule of thumb on how recent a neuropsych eval should have been done to be accepted as documentation?
Yeah, so the rule of thumb generally is within 3 to 5 years. Anything older than 5 years, if your child is 18, 19, anything older than that means that they were 12, 13 years old, which again, I had spoken about previously. It just means that the scales that were run during that exam were meant for children. If it falls within the 3 to 5 years when they're coming to college, it just means that they were given adult scales then. It changes the numbers and basically the documentation reads more as if I'm looking at a young adult as opposed to a small child. So anything over 3 to 5 years is the general rule of thumb. That's best practices of the ADA. It's best practices of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's pretty common among colleges and universities. Like I had said before, especially now during a pandemic, it's difficult to get new and updated documentation. And my office has been working very closely with families saying that if it falls within the 3 to 5 years, great, we'll take it. If it's 6 years or so, okay, we'll look at it. But if it's really anything over that, we will put accommodations in on a temporary basis until it's time for you to get something supplemental. And sometimes that might mean a whole new neuropsych, especially if what you're getting, or a whole new, you know, whatever documentation went into creating the IEP. But I'm also conscious of the fact that that costs thousands and thousands of dollars, and I don't want anyone to be, you know, I don't want anyone to miss out on services because either they can't afford it or they can't obtain it. So we really try and work on, well, what kind of supplemental? Can your medical doctor write something? Do you see a private therapist? Can they just write a letter verifying that this is still valid, you know, valid accommodations being asked for? So there's workarounds. It's just very much a conversation with us.
Great. So this one, I don't know if we've discussed this. So my child has diabetes and I am concerned about how he will navigate that in college. Should I direct him to your office for support?
Yeah, so we can support a student with that diagnosis as far as classroom accommodations go, or potentially housing accommodations. Students that have to have access to food and drink in the classroom, that might seem rote. Of course, they can have food and drink in any classroom, but there are certain classes where certain labs where you cannot have food or drink in a lab setting. But so long as they're accommodated through our office, I can put that in place. So that way, once the professor gets the accommodation accommodation letter, they realize, oh, okay, John is allowed to have these items in our lab. He might just have to sit near the door, or he might not be able to have the drink on the table, but we'll provide a chair in the corner for him to keep it on. So I can put those kinds of accommodations in place, but I also refer a lot of students who have medical diagnoses to health services on campus, because they can help students find providers in the area or resources in the area, especially if it's a student coming from out of town. And then I also refer a lot of students specifically with diabetes to our dining services. We have a dietitian on campus. Her name is Siobhan Cloran. You can find her information on the dining services website. She is a wealth of information. She is a very gentle, kind person. I enjoy working with her tremendously. She really puts people at ease. There is a lot of support for students with that particular diagnosis on campus, or really any kind of food allergy or dietary concern. And so we point a lot of students in that direction as a referral, and then they would make an appointment with them to talk with them.
Can you talk a little bit about housing and accommodations, like if a student wants or needs a single?
Yeah, so our office helps implement housing accommodations. We do not place students. That is 100% residential services. Instead, we ensure accommodations are put in place. My office is part of an accommodated housing committee. It's myself, it's the director of counseling services, the director of health services, dining services. Usually someone from the dean of students is there, and then also res services. There are timelines to these kinds of accommodations just because the way housing works and how, they're set to pretty tight timelines. So for example, an incoming first-year student would have to supply housing accommodated documentation to my office by June 1st. All of this is on our website too, so if you go look at it, all the dates and the forms are there. There's a few different forms that students have to fill in. And what happens is that as students submit those forms and all of that documentation comes into my office, I partner with our campus partners. So anybody with any kind of psychological diagnosis that might need a housing accommodation, that would be, their documentation would be looked at by counseling services. Anyone with a medical diagnosis, their documentation would be looked at health services. And then we come together as a group and figure out what accommodations can be put in place, what is doable, what isn't. And we work really hard to ensure that happens. And then once we, approve all the students, or there are times where we have to say, I'm so sorry, but your documentation, this is what you're looking for, but you don't have any documentation to support it. That's where we get back to the student and say, you need to provide more documentation. But for students who are approved, that whole list, I've got a giant spreadsheet of it. It gets sent to res services, and then res services, it's like a puzzle. They're literally plucking people into where does this student fit that has their needs accommodated. Sometimes students don't like where they're placed, but that's where it's part of the interactive process saying, these are the 3 housing accommodations that you asked for or were approved for. And this is the one space on campus where it fits all of your needs. And then that's kind of like a little light bulb moment. Oh, okay, this might be not what I was looking for, but it's what I need. So this is where I have to be placed. So it's a lot of interaction between res services and our office. So that happens for first-year students in June. For upper class students, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, that happens in January, because then we're making placements for the following fall. So basically it's June, January. And students who have a housing accommodation, they have to request that each year. But they get an email from me saying, hey, now's the time, submit your form again. I really stay on top of that so nobody falls behind.
We have some more questions coming in. So my son has slow processing speed. This sometimes manifests as appearing to ignore a question as he processes and forms his answer. How would you suggest he addresses this with what type of documentation might be needed for extended test time? We did not think he needed this until he took an AP test this spring and did not finish.
Yeah, so that's where you'd want to talk to your medical provider. If your student has a diagnosis of some kind that indicates slow processing, there will be a provider, someone that knows your son, that can speak to that can draw up documentation that would say, again, his name, diagnosis, what are the limitations. In this case, he can't finish exams on time due to a slow processing speed. What accommodations should we put in place? Extended time on exams. Once that documentation can be written up, you'd send it to me, and that's how we would help process that. As far as like slow processing and answering, we have 2 accommodations for testing. It's time and a half or double time. That's very standard across the board in all colleges and universities. Meaning if the class, someone with time and a half, if the class had an hour, they would have an hour and a half. If the class had an hour, someone with double time would have 2 hours. And we put that in place based on documentation. So we in order to put that accommodation in place, really everything comes back to documentation. But it's also important too to notice that sometimes you might not need that accommodation. It might have just been a one and done thing in high school, where sometimes students might not be able to get documentation, or maybe a doctor will say, you don't have a diagnosis. This is just something your high school helped you with. That might be where you want to really, really advocate with your professor and say, I'm struggling, you know, how can you help me? Like I said, we can put temporary accommodations in place, but other times it's a conversation with your professor too, especially if you only need a few extra minutes. But yeah, I hope, did that answer the question? I feel like I ran.
And I think just as a follow-up to that, do you have any recommendations for in-class or discussions for this?
Yes, I think that it's difficult for a lot of students to do, but you've got to be your own best self-advocate, which I think it's a learning curve. Students, you know, they'll get there. They just might not be there as a first-year student, but they will get there. But maybe having that conversation with your professor during office hours, or if you're too embarrassed or uncomfortable for whatever reason speaking to the professor, you can email them. That's the beauty of emails. You can just sit there and type an answer and say, I am a student that's involved in your class. I'm a strong student. I want to be doing the work. I just hesitate a bit when called on. Could you maybe not call on me unless I raise my hand? A lot of classes on campus, it's unlike high school where the professor is just calling on you and calling on you. They more or less wait for students to, you know, raise their hand or engage on their own. So I think that that's a good conversation to have with your professor. And then as far as group work and project work, again, you know, saying to your teammates to say, you know what, it just takes me a little bit longer to process what you were saying. Just give me a second and I'll get back to you. I think a lot of students get nervous to advocate like that, but the more you do it, it's a habit. The more you do it, the more you're building it, the more people realize, oh, just give Amy 5 seconds and she'll get there. You know, that's my own best advice, which is easier said than done. It's just a habit that needs to be built.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So next question. So STEM fields are known for having more concentrated number of students with Asperger's or high functioning autism.
Yes.
I bet this is also true at WPI.
Yes.
What percentage of the students are on the autism spectrum?
Out of our student population, our students, I believe it's 11% of the students that are registered in my office fall on the spectrum. It's a significant number, and those are just students that have disclosed to my office. I have no idea how many students are out there that have not disclosed. But we do have a fair number of students registered with our office that are on the spectrum. I think that that's something that is, like you said, is very common in the STEM field, and it's no different at WPI.
So my child is comfortable in not reaching out about these types of things. Can I be a part of those meetings or set them up for my child?
Yes, you can absolutely. As an incoming first-year student, yes, you can be part of the process of setting up appointments or, you know, starting the conversation. But once school starts, once, you know, the term begins, my office will be reaching out to students. So I'll give you an example. We're doing all our intakes in the summer. So far, we've intaked probably 77 or 78 incoming first-year students. Once we get closer to the start of A term, every single one of them are going to get an email from me saying, hey, now is the time to submit your accommodation letter. Remember, we talked about this during your intake meeting, and I'll also give an infographic too, a step-by-step, do this, do this, do this. But also as a reminder, this is the person that you did your intake with, whether it's myself or my 2 coworkers, Jessica or Taylor. Now's the time to reach out to them to set up an appointment if you'd like to meet to talk about anything you're confused about or anything you're nervous about, or just looking at your syllabus and figuring out time management. I'll send that email out, and then probably about a week into the term, I'll send up a follow-up email. But then after that, it's up to the students to be reaching out to us. And it's not because we're done and, oh, you're not answering my email. Like I said, there are over 650 students registered with our office, and we are a very well utilized office. So we have a lot of meetings with students here and there. So it's just important for students to check their email and just and reach out. But if a parent calls to say, I want to, create a, schedule a time for you to meet with my daughter, you can do that. It just becomes awkward sometimes. We'd much rather hear from the student just to get them used to speaking to us.
Sorry, pet problems.
All right.
So one more question I had, does my student need to register with your office in order to ask for extra time on tests?
Yes. There will always be some professors that may give extended time without having an accommodation letter, but more often than not, a professor will not give extended time unless they get a letter from my office verifying that the student has vetted this information with my office. Most professors look to that letter. And so students would have to disclose to us. And again, I can't say this enough. We do not share private information. I don't share diagnoses. I don't contact a professor and say, hey, Susan's got ADHD. I don't do anything like that with professors. It's literally just a very basic form letter. When I do an intake with a student, I actually show them what their letter looks like so they can see with their own eyes and be like, oh, yeah, that really is very basic. It's just to send the information, the accommodation information out there.
Okay. My student was able to have alternate assignments in high school. Can that be accommodated in a college setting?
For the most part, no. Going back to, we cannot fundamentally alter the curriculum. When a professor writes their curriculum, in high school, they're following a state mandated curriculum. So you can kind of change things as you see fit, or I'm not a high school teacher, so I don't want to put words in their mouth, but you can change things around with a little bit more ease. In a college setting, the professor is writing their own individual curriculum that they are following to meet requirements to pass that class. Asking them to change the curriculum in their own classroom is usually a no-go. That more or less boils down to time management. How are you managing your time to get the work done? WPI moves at warp speed. It is a very, very, very fast-paced academic setting, and it's really important for students to stay on top of their time management, their executive functioning skills. And that's where my office steps in. All these meetings that I talk about that we have with students, like I talk a lot about self-advocacy, skill building, but we also do a tremendous amount of support for students with time management organization. How are you looking at your week and realizing you have a quiz, a test, a project, an exam? How are you getting all of that done and being prepared for all of that in the time that you have? So we meet with a lot of students to talk about that, just so they don't feel like they have to ask for different assignments, because more often than not, a professor is going to say no.
Well, I think you answered a lot of questions, Amy, and I'm so glad. I mean, I think it's wonderful that we have this opportunity to learn more before these students even get to college. So that'll help the students and the parents for what is to be expected in the coming year or 2 years.
Yes.
So I did put, just for parents, FYI, if you want to look at Amy's office, her website, I just stuck in the chat section there, so you can visit the Office of Accessibility Services to see all the great things they offer and just to familiarize yourself as you move forward.
Sure.
So we will record this, as you know, and we'll let you know where you can find it.
Sure. There's just one last thing I would like to add just real quick, that since this is for a lot of parents that have juniors in high school, correct?
Yeah, juniors and seniors.
When you are coming to campus for a tour someday, whenever that may be, if we're having in-person tours, you can set up an appointment with one of us in the office. I meet with during the springtime before COVID. I met with a lot of parents and their students when they would come for a tour and then stay for an hour after or half an hour after, and they meet with me or other people in my office. You can still set up those appointments just to ask these kinds of questions. I think anytime that you can, reach out to us. It just kind of helps put people's minds at ease and realize that, we're not gonna lure you along and make you feel like you can get these accommodations and then we won't give them to you. You kind of hear horror stories about that, on other parenting pages and such. And so it's just nice, reach out to us. We will help answer your questions. We'll point you in the right direction. We want even though your child isn't matriculated, we want them to come to WPI and we want them to feel supported and we want them to be successful. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out.
That's a great idea, Amy. I don't know that I would have thought of that. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Sure.
All right. So again, thank you all for joining us here. If you missed part of this or want to hop on, we will be doing the same session again on Monday, August 3rd at 6 p.m. So, and I'm sure discussions could go in a different way depending on who's on the call. There's always different questions. So if you want to join us then, you'll be looking for that invitation coming up in your parent email. But thanks again for joining us and I hope you all have a great day. And thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.